I was sitting with some friends, and he came over to the table, and he said, "Frank, do me a favor, will you?" He said, "I'm sitting with a very pretty girl."
For over 5 decades, Don Rickles made the world laugh with his razor-sharp wit and fearless jabs. But behind the jokes was a friendship that ran deeper than most ever knew, his bond with Frank Sinatra. For years, fans whispered about the true nature of their connection.
We could sit at a table and a guy would come over and say, "Hello, Frank, how are you?" And Frank would say,
Was it loyalty, fear, or something far more complicated? Just before his death, Don Rickles finally broke his silence, and what he shared left even his closest friends speechless. Join us as we uncover shocking details that changes everything. Before Don Rickles became a comedy superstar, he was just a short, loud kid growing up in Queens, New York. Born in 1926 to Jewish immigrant parents, he wasn't a class clown, he was the class menace. Teachers called him disruptive. Other kids couldn't figure out if he was funny or just fearless. But that raw edge came from somewhere. Rickles' father, Max, was a quiet insurance salesman who struggled to make ends meet. His mother, Etta, was the complete opposite, sharp-tongued and well-known in the neighborhood as someone who never backed down. That's where Don got his fire. He didn't grow up wealthy, but he learned early that laughter could diffuse tension, stop a bully, or win over a room. As a teenager, he tried acting but bombed every audition. He wasn't handsome, he wasn't smooth, and no one could figure out where he could fit. So he turned to comedy. Not polished jokes, just pure instinct. Insult comedy wasn't a style yet, but Rickles invented it in real time, and the way he used it would soon catch the attention of a man who wasn't used to being laughed at. By the late 1950s, Don Rickles had already learned one hard truth about show business. Talent didn't matter if nobody liked you, and back then, very few people liked Rickles. He wasn't a classic joke teller, and he definitely didn't care about being polite. Instead of winning over crowds with charm, he came in swinging. He'd tear through his audience with a microphone, mocking their haircuts, their drinks, even their faces. No one was off limits. And that was the problem. Most club owners were terrified of him. One even tried to unplug his microphone mid-set. Bookings dried up in some cities because customers were walking out. He wasn't just bombing, he was scaring people. But Rickles didn't stop. He doubled down, believing there had to be some room in entertainment for a guy who wasn't fake, who didn't pander, and who didn't need a script to be funny. What he didn't know was that one night in a smoky Miami nightclub, his style would collide with the most powerful man in entertainment and change the course of his entire life. It was a Friday night at Murray Franklin's, a club known for 2 things: stiff drinks and surprise guests. Rickles was the late act. He didn't know who was in the room until he got on stage. That night, as the spotlight hit him, he looked into the crowd and spotted a face no comedian wanted to see staring back. Frank Sinatra, a man with rumored mob ties, political connections, and a temper that had made even studio heads flinch. Frank was the guy everyone tiptoed around, the man whose presence turned conversations quiet and made grown men stand up straight. And here was Rickles, standing with a microphone and a choice. He could ignore him, play it safe, pretend he didn't see him, or he could do what no one else ever had. Without missing a beat, Rickles pointed toward Sinatra and shouted, "Hey Frank, make yourself at home. Hit somebody." The room froze. Laughter stopped mid-breath. Even the waiters stopped moving. But Rickles didn't blink. He stood there, grinning, waiting for the hammer to drop. And then it happened. Sinatra leaned back and laughed. And once Sinatra laughed, the whole room followed. It was the kind of moment that splits time in half. Rickles didn't know it yet, but his life had just changed. After the set, Rickles walked off stage expecting who knows what. A handshake? A warning? Maybe nothing. But as he stepped into the dressing room, there was Sinatra, already waiting with a drink in hand and a smirk on his face. The first thing he said wasn't, "Are you nuts?" or "Don't ever do that again." It was something Rickles would later call the greatest compliment of his life. Sinatra said, "You got guts, kid. I like that." That's how it started. No contracts, no promises, just that one moment of mutual respect between 2 men who couldn't have been more different. Sinatra, the elegant crooner with power. Rickles, the loud-mouthed kid from Queens who didn't know when to shut up. But that night, something clicked. Sinatra didn't just laugh at Rickles. He needed Rickles. Everyone around Frank was afraid of him. Rickles wasn't. And in a world where no one said no to Sinatra, Rickles said the unthinkable, night after night. Word spread fast. Suddenly, Rickles wasn't just another comic, he was Frank's comic. That label was dangerous, but it was also golden. Doors opened, shows booked. Producers who once wouldn't return Rickles's calls now begged him to appear. And Sinatra made it known. If Rickles was playing somewhere, he might show up. That alone was enough to fill seats. For the first time in his life, Rickles had power. But what came with it was something no one warned him about. Attention, speculation, and rumors that never really stopped. People started asking questions. Why would Frank Sinatra, a man known for his pride and ego, allow someone like Rickles to humiliate him in public over and over again? Was it just friendship, or was there something more to it? Some said Sinatra was using Rickles as a shield, a way to seem down to earth. Others whispered that Rickles had seen or heard things that gave him leverage. The kind of leverage that kept him untouchable, even when he crossed the line. Whatever the truth was, one thing was clear. Rickles had done the impossible. He made the most feared man in showbiz laugh at himself. And that single moment in a Miami club would define their relationship for decades. But as Rickles would later learn, being inside Frank Sinatra's circle came with rules, and breaking them had consequences. Frank Sinatra wasn't used to being challenged. He was a man of control over his career, his image, and the people around him. But Rickles wasn't scared. Maybe it was because he came from a working-class Jewish family in Queens. Or maybe it was because he had already been ignored and rejected so many times, he had nothing left to lose. Whatever it was, Rickles didn't flinch. And Sinatra, who could crush people with a word, seemed to crave that chaos. They started appearing everywhere together. Rickles would perform, then Frank would bring him out for an encore insult. They had dinner in Beverly Hills, private parties in Vegas, late-night calls from coast to coast. Sinatra once told friends that Rickles made him laugh like no one else ever had. But not everyone believed it was just about comedy. Some even speculated that Rickles had seen things that most people never got close enough to witness. Sinatra's rage, his breakdowns, and his private dealings. FBI files released years later listed Rickles as a known associate present at multiple events under surveillance. Nobody in show business was safe from scandal, especially in the 1960s and 70s when tabloids were beginning to rise and secrets didn't stay buried long. But Rickles? He moved through that world untouched. No blackmails and no betrayals. He was either extremely loyal or dangerously smart. Rickles never joked about Sinatra's family. He never touched the mob rumors. He avoided the women, the politics, the dark corners of Sinatra's life. He could joke about his temper, his voice, his suits, but he knew where the landmines were buried, and he stepped around them carefully. That awareness separated Rickles from everyone else who tried to copy his style. He wasn't just roasting Sinatra. He was performing a delicate, high-stakes act where one wrong word could destroy everything. And Sinatra, in return, gave him a level of protection that most comics could only dream of. But the relationship still raised eyebrows, especially because in public they were so mismatched. Sinatra was sleek, polished, a global icon. Rickles was loud and wrinkled. Their chemistry didn't make sense until you understood what it was built on. Still, people wondered, could a friendship that unbalanced truly be equal? Or was Rickles just the funny man allowed at the king's table, as long as he kept dancing? Whatever the answer, one thing was clear. Don Rickles had learned how to walk the tightrope. But no one can stay balanced forever, and the day he slipped, even just a little, would reveal how fragile that bond really was. Don Rickles didn't just survive Frank Sinatra's circle, he thrived in it. In a world full of yes men, Rickles was the only one who got away with no, the only one who could insult Frank to his face in front of a crowd and leave the stage not just unharmed, but applauded. Insiders began asking questions. Why did Sinatra let Rickles poke fun at him on national television when others had been cut off for less? Why did he laugh when Rickles joked about his drinking, his ex-wives, and even his rumored mob connections? Frank was known for holding grudges. Even among the Rat Pack, Rickles was different. Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. were performers, entertainers who kept the party going. Rickles was a disruptor, a wild card who never played the same hand twice. And yet Frank never pulled him aside to say, tone it down. He never told him to read from a script. That kind of freedom was unheard of in Sinatra's world, but not everyone liked it. Old friends of Frank started to pull back. They thought Rickles was getting too comfortable, that he was using the relationship to elevate himself. But to Rickles, it was never about status. It was about survival. He knew the rules, even if no one ever said them out loud. Rickles never broke those rules, not once, and that's why he lasted, not just as a friend, but as a fixture, a living reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room isn't the guy with power, it's the one who makes him laugh. But even Rickles couldn't balance forever, and it was only a matter of time before one misstep cracked the surface and nearly destroyed their friendship. By the mid-1960s, the Sands Hotel had become their playground. Sinatra practically lived there, and Rickles was a regular fixture, the comedic hitman who could take down a room full of millionaires with one-liners and smirks. Their chemistry was legendary, but Vegas had its own rules. Power played a different game in that city, and one night, Rickles gambled a little too hard with the wrong joke and nearly lost everything. It was a private performance, an invite-only affair packed with Hollywood elites, Vegas tycoons, and a few men whose names never showed up on paper. Sinatra was the headliner, as always. Rickles was the special guest, hand-picked by Frank himself. These were the gigs Rickles lived for. No censors, no cameras. Just him, the mic, and a room full of people who thought they'd heard it all. At first, the set was vintage Rickles, fast, savage, and fearless. He took shots at Dean Martin, called out a casino owner's toupee, even jabbed a senator about his second wife. The crowd roared. Then he turned to Sinatra, who was seated front and center with a cigarette in one hand and a drink in the other. Rickles leaned in, smirked, and fired off a line that hit harder than expected. "Frank, let's not kid ourselves. You're not the leader of the Rat Pack. You're just the guy they're all afraid to leave alone with a telephone." It wasn't the usual roast, too close to the rumors, the stories, the long-standing whispers about Sinatra's power, his calls, and the mysterious ways things always seemed to go his way. People laughed, but nervously. Some didn't laugh at all. Sinatra didn't move. He just stared at Rickles. Then, without a word, he stood up and walked out. No goodbye, just silence. Rickles wrapped the set, keeping the energy high, but inside, he knew something had gone wrong. He had seen that look before, on the faces of people who'd crossed Sinatra and disappeared from show business within a year, the men who thought they were in the circle until they weren't. Backstage, the mood was tense. Sinatra didn't return. His people said he had another event to attend, but Rickles knew the truth. He'd gone too far. For days, Rickles heard nothing. He performed, but the sparkle was gone. His jokes about Sinatra stopped cold. Friends said he was shaken, maybe even scared. In public, he kept up the act, but behind closed doors, he was pacing. Because this wasn't just a friendship, it was his career, his security, and his identity. The whispers started almost immediately, that Rickles had been frozen out, that Sinatra had given the order. No more appearances, no more stage time, no more favors. For Rickles, that kind of exile could have been fatal, not just socially, but financially. But then came the twist no one expected. Sinatra didn't ban him. Instead, a week later, Rickles got a quiet phone call. Sinatra wanted to see him, alone. No press, no audience. Just the two of them, at Sinatra's Palm Springs home. Rickles arrived unsure of what to expect. An apology, a scolding, or a goodbye. What he got was none of that. They sat, had drinks, and barely talked about the incident. Sinatra didn't yell. He didn't ask for an explanation. What he did say, though, was simple and unforgettable. "You got one pass, Don. Just one." It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. The rules hadn't changed, but Rickles had come closer to breaking them than anyone before him. And Sinatra, whether out of respect or restraint, had decided not to pull the plug. That decision said everything. Rickles mattered, but so did the balance. After that night, things seemed to go back to normal. They performed together again. The jokes returned. The crowd laughed, but something had shifted beneath the surface. Rickles was still sharp. He avoided certain topics. He gave Sinatra space on nights when the energy felt off. The edge was still there, but the danger was gone. And in a world built on loyalty, one wrong line almost cost him his life. Don Rickles made millions laugh, but he built his legacy on something even more powerful than comedy: silence. Behind every insult, every roast, every slapstick line that left celebrities gasping and crowds in hysterics, Rickles was sitting on decades of secrets, and none loomed larger than what he knew about Frank Sinatra. Because Rickles had seen it all, not the Sinatra from album covers or smooth-talking late-night interviews. The real Sinatra, and Rickles never spoke a word. That kind of silence, deliberate, practiced, and consistent, didn't go unnoticed. People began to realize Rickles was more than a friend. He was a vault, a man who had every reason to tell the world what he'd seen but never once considered doing it, not even for money. In the 1980s, when Sinatra's mysteries reached godlike proportions, the tabloids came circling. They wanted stories. Stories Rickles had. Offers came from magazines, publishers, even TV producers. 6 figures, sometimes more, just for one on-the-record comment. Rickles turned them all down. He didn't even hesitate. Even when careers around him faded, even when his own momentum slowed, Rickles never traded in his loyalty. Not once. Not even when it would have been the easy way to stay relevant in a changing industry. He played clubs, he did interviews, but when Sinatra's name came up, he'd smile, fire off a harmless wisecrack, and move on. Whatever truth he had, he kept locked away. People close to Rickles said it wasn't just respect, it was protection. Rickles had seen how fragile Sinatra could be beneath the bravado. He saw the pain behind the showman's eyes, especially in private moments that no one else witnessed. And that's why Sinatra trusted him. In return, Rickles didn't need anything from Frank. He didn't ask for roles or favors. He showed up when it mattered and disappeared when it didn't. And in Sinatra's world, where loyalty was rare and fakes were common, Rickles was real. But not everyone saw it as noble. Some accused Rickles of enabling Sinatra's darker side, but Rickles never flinched. He believed that loyalty meant standing by someone, even when they were hard to stand by. That belief defined him, even when it hurts. And yet, carrying that silence came at a cost. Over the years, it weighed on him. Those who knew him well said he sometimes sat in silence after shows, just thinking. But toward the end of his life, something changed. Rickles began to reflect more openly, not in confessions, but in small, careful comments. A story that would only come to light when Rickles was finally ready to let the mask fall. And when he did, it would be just one line. No punchline, no laugh, just a truth he'd buried for decades. By the late 1980s, the fire that had once fueled Las Vegas, Hollywood, and nightclubs across the country had begun to dim. Frank Sinatra was aging, and the world around him was changing fast. His voice, still unmistakable, had lost some of its thunder. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, grew tired. He was no longer the invincible force people whispered about in back rooms. He was a man nearing the end of a towering legacy, and right there beside him, still cracking jokes and still refusing to let time soften his edge, was Don Rickles. Their friendship had shifted. The late-night parties were fewer. The stage time had slowed. But the loyalty, that never wavered. Rickles stayed close, not out of obligation, but because he knew Sinatra better than anyone. He didn't see the headlines or the history books when he looked at him. He saw a man who had once taken a chance on a kid with a big mouth and never asked for anything in return. In private, they talked less and sat more. The energy that once powered their chemistry was replaced by comfort, a glance, a smirk, a memory brought up with one word. They didn't need to perform for each other anymore. They had outgrown the show. Now it was just about being there. And then, in 1998, Frank Sinatra died. The world mourned. Everyone had a version of Frank, singer, actor, and activist. But the man? Very few had truly seen him. Rickles didn't try to correct the story. He didn't grandstand or insert himself into the public tributes. He didn't even release a statement right away. What he did was quieter. He flew to California, sat at the funeral. No spotlight, no jokes, just silence. Those close to Rickles said he was different afterward. Something had closed off, not in bitterness, but in grief. Losing Sinatra was like losing a part of his identity. They weren't just linked by fame. They were part of the same machine. Two outsiders who had found their place in a world that chewed people up and spit them out. But Rickles had lasted because of Frank, and now Frank was gone. Over the next few years, interviewers kept bringing Sinatra up. Every talk show host wanted a juicy story, some behind-the-scenes moment the world hadn't heard, but Rickles wouldn't play that game. He gave people the surface, a wink, a safe joke, a quick line about Frank's temper or how he let him live, but you could see it. He was holding something back. Then, one night, it slipped. It was a quiet interview on a lesser-known program, not one of the big, flashy late-night shows. The host asked gently, "What do you think people misunderstood about Frank?" Rickles didn't joke. He didn't deflect. He just said, "He was the most loyal guy I ever knew, and the loneliest." That was it. He didn't explain, didn't clarify. The room stayed silent. The host, stunned, moved on. But that moment hung in the air like a curtain lifting on something no one had dared to look at before. That single sentence shattered decades of myth-making. It wasn't about Sinatra the icon. It was about Frank the man. A man who gave everything to everyone and still felt alone. A man who stood at the top of the world and still called a comedian in the middle of the night just to not feel empty. Rickles had seen it, and for the first time, he let the world see it too, but only a glimpse. Because Rickles knew that truth didn't need a stage. It didn't need applause. He'd spent his whole life burying secrets in punchlines. Now, at the end, he let just one truth escape, and it was enough to reframe everything. After that, he never talked about Sinatra like that again. Not in that tone, not with that weight. But if you watched him closely, you could see it in his eyes when Frank's name came up. A softness, a sadness, a flicker of respect that never quite dimmed. In his final tours, when someone in the crowd shouted out, "Frank!" Rickles would pause. Sometimes he'd fire back with a joke. Sometimes he'd just nod. And occasionally he'd look out at the audience with that same quiet stare and say he was one of a kind. Then he'd move on, back to the act, back to the jokes, back to being Don Rickles. But those who paid attention knew that something sacred had just passed through the room, because in the end, Rickles didn't need to write a book or spill secrets to confirm the rumors. He didn't need to say everything. He just needed to say enough. When Don Rickles passed away in April 2017, at the age of 90, people didn't just lose a comedian. They lost a thread to an era that no longer existed. The golden age of live entertainment, the heyday of smoky Vegas lounges and private backroom deals, the world of Rat Pack legends and untouchable stars. Rickles had outlived nearly all of them, but even in his final years, he never acted like the last man standing. He was still cracking jokes, still taking the stage, and still dodging every opportunity to tell the story people always wanted most, the story of Frank Sinatra. For decades, Rickles had been the only person allowed to mock Sinatra in public. He'd built a brand on it, but as time passed and Sinatra faded into myth, that laughter turned into curiosity. What did Rickles really know? What had he seen? What truths had he buried under those biting one-liners? The truth is, Rickles saw it all. He was there during Sinatra's rise, his reign, and his slow retreat from the spotlight. He saw the charm that captivated presidents and mob bosses alike. He saw the fury that made grown men tremble, and he saw the cracks, the loneliness, the cost of being an icon in a world that never stopped watching. And yet, Rickles never turned that knowledge into headlines. He never cashed in. He never sat across from a journalist and spilled what the world was dying to hear. Not because no one asked. They did, constantly. But because he believed in something more important than attention: loyalty. It would have been easy to write a tell-all. Rickles could have filled pages with private moments, off-the-record stories, and first-hand accounts of the chaos that swirled around Sinatra's life. He had the material, he had the credibility, and he had the audience. But he didn't do it. Instead, Rickles made a decision that seemed almost outdated in the modern era. He protected his friend. Even after Sinatra's death in 1998, Rickles kept his mouth shut. He never tried to reshape the narrative, never attempted to insert himself into the myth. He didn't need to. Their friendship was real, and it existed far beyond what the public saw. In truth, the public never saw more than a glimpse. Frank didn't need fans, he had millions. He didn't need followers, he had power. But what he lacked, what he craved most, was trust. And Rickles gave him that, not through words, but through silence. That silence was its own kind of testimony. In a world obsessed with spilling secrets and exposing flaws, Rickles chose dignity. He knew Sinatra's faults. He saw the dark moods, the occasional cruelty, the bruising pressure of being Frank Sinatra, but he never weaponized it. He carried it with him, quietly, privately, until the end. Even when Rickles himself neared the end of his life, he never broke the code. He still got up on stage. He still tossed jabs about Frank's suits, his ego, his swagger, but it was always with a glint of reverence, a tone that had softened with time. He could still make people laugh at Sinatra, but you could feel the affection underneath. At his final shows, when someone in the audience would shout Sinatra's name, Rickles would pause. Sometimes he'd nod, sometimes he'd fire off a quick joke, but occasionally, just occasionally, he would grow quiet, as if remembering not just a friend, but a piece of himself that had never quite left. Because Sinatra wasn't just a chapter in Rickles' life, he was the frame. Their friendship wasn't about business or survival, it was about connection. Two men, both born into tough neighborhoods, both fighting for a place in a world that didn't hand out kindness easily. They found each other, and for more than 4 decades, they held that bond in place, not with promises, but with presence. In the end, Don Rickles didn't need to confirm any rumors. He didn't need to prove what was real. He proved it with every show he didn't cancel after Frank died, every story he didn't tell, every spotlight he turned away from when it meant betraying a friend. And that silence, after a lifetime of noise, was the clearest answer of all. By the time Don Rickles took his final bow, the world had already rewritten Frank Sinatra 100 different ways. He was a singer, a legend, a brute, a charmer, a mob associate, a patriot. No story stuck for long, because Sinatra, even in death, remained larger than any single label. But the one man who had the clearest view of him never tried to define him. He just chose to remember him. And in that choice, Rickles said everything the public had spent decades guessing. Because here's the truth, Rickles didn't deny the rumors. He didn't confirm them either. He walked right past them, like they didn't deserve his breath. But that didn't mean he didn't know. It meant he knew better. Better than to feed headlines. Better than to reduce a man's life to whispers and shadows. Better than to take the easy applause by exposing something sacred. What Don Rickles confirmed, without ever needing to spell it out, was that his friendship with Sinatra wasn't for sale. Not to producers, not to the press, not even to history. And in a business where even childhood memories are sold for profit, that kind of silence is almost shocking. It's also rare. Most people in Hollywood don't keep secrets. They trade them. But Rickles held on, not for leverage, but out of love. And that's why, in the end, his loyalty spoke louder than any tell-all memoir ever could. Because when you're standing next to power that big, next to a name like Sinatra, it's easy to get pulled into the gravity, easy to lose yourself. Rickles never did. He remained himself, loud, unfiltered, brutally funny. But when it came to Frank, he also became something else. Something that's not easy to come by when fame is at stake. A protector. And that's the final twist people often miss. Rickles didn't just survive Sinatra's world, he shaped it. He gave it permission to laugh at itself. He softened the hardest image in show business, not by challenging it, but by understanding it. Deep down, Rickles knew what made Sinatra tick. He knew the insecurities, the pain, the moments of solitude buried beneath the spotlight. That's why, when Rickles finally said those few quiet words, that's what Rickles protected. Not secrets, but humanity. And now, with both of them gone, all we're left with is the silence they shared. The kind of silence that doesn't hide something. It honors it. But what exactly did Rickles witness that kept him quiet all those years? What truth sat behind that single line he finally shared? And if he had lived longer, would he have said more? Share your thoughts in the comments below and click the next video on a screen where we uncover another interesting story.